Thank you for being so resilient. After a long day with lots of presentations, we have this final session, which will probably be the best one. So good that you stayed. So we have the privilege today to have Michael Parker as a guest. And for those of us working in ethics, Michael Parker is kind of a superstar in the field of ethics. You've been very much involved in genomics, biobanking, global health. And we know for sure that you can provide lots of very interesting points to the Lifebrain consortium. You're the director of the Ethox Center and a professor in bioethics at the University of Oxford. I give you a floor for about 20 minutes to talk about data sharing, and then I take over and introduce myself afterwards. Please, Michael, go ahead.
Thanks very much. Can everyone hear me? It looks like, yeah, sounds like it. Well, firstly, I'm really delighted to be here today, and you're obviously thinking about the future, and it'd be good to hear about your plans later, but this is very much the involved in hearing about this network. So, very happy to be involved in there today, but also possibly in the future. I'm just really happy to be here. I apologize for the way I'm dressed, but also the slides. I've been running a conference I'm in the middle of running a conference this week myself with 200 people from low and middle income countries. So running between things and not really paying attention to everything I should be paying attention to. Anyway, great. So just thought I've got, say, 12 slides, something like that, just to introduce a few ideas. Data sharing is sort of the idea behind it all, but it's not all about data sharing. It will raise a number of other issues. One of the things that's quite important to say up front, I think, when you're doing a talk about ethics is, to try to head off a few kind of ways in which people tend to think about ethics. My guess is that's not true of people in this room, but nonetheless, it's worth saying that ethics is often viewed as a hurdle, as a set of bureaucratic and other kind of structures that you have to overcome in order to do your research. So it's often seen as being in opposition to research and innovation, and that's not the way I understand it, and that's not the way I hope it's going to come across today. But actually, there are a number of ways in which it's just not the case, not the reality. Clearly, there are ethics committees out there and ethics regulations. But there are a whole range of other ways of thinking about ethics. One of the starting points for me has always been that, if you think about what's the most important ethical issue in medical research, well, it's the fact that medical research should be done and that we need to develop our understanding if we're going to improve health services of a range of different kinds. So there are really strong ethical reasons for doing medical research and broader biological and other kinds of research. The key thing to remember, though, from my perspective, is to think about ethics as an integrated part and partner in that process. So identifying, clarifying, addressing, understanding ethical issues and working through to some solutions is a key to successful science, particularly when you're thinking about large-scale science, data-driven science like this that you've been working on. So that's the way I think about ethics. And if you want to know more about my center and the work we do, then there's a link on the slide. But that's just a starting point to sort of head off a few things. I also thought it might be worth saying something about the way in which ethicists have tended to think about what we tend to call neuroethics. I'm not going to talk about these things, but if you look at the neuroethics literature, the sorts of things that will come up, well, one thing that I may say something about is, well, what do you do with incidental findings when you're doing kind of brain images or imaging of other kinds? How should one think about those and our responsibilities to cope with them? But there are other sorts of issues in that literature that are important, slightly esoteric, but nonetheless really interesting. So issues to do with cognitive enhancement, for example, and the ethics of that, when that is acceptable and when it isn't. Questions to do with the possibility of mind reading and the implications for privacy and the ways in which we think about the interior life as part of as our sort of private world. Possible uses, I guess, related to that, but possibly in other ways too. Possible ways in which neuroscience and data around the mind might be misused in a whole range of different ways. And there are a number of other issues which I personally find very interesting and I've read about, but I'm not engaged myself, which are to do with questions of authenticity and changes in identity. So if there are possibilities of intervening in the brain, which might, for example, address some sort of problem, which is quite closely related to someone's identity. How should one think about consent in relation to the person before and after the intervention? When there are questions raised about whether it's the same person or a different person, how should one think about authenticity in the context of interventions in the brain? And then there are a whole range of questions relating to mind-computer interactions of various kinds, and how might one think about responsibility in that sort of setting. So those are lots of things you'll see in the neuroethics literature, but I'm not going to talk about those unless you ask questions about them, of course. The way I tend to think about ethics, and it relates to the way I introduced it earlier, is to try to think about ways of identifying and addressing practical ethical issues that would arise for people like you in your work. So scientists and funders, for example, patients and doctors. So what are the kind of ethical issues that arise for you in your day-to-day work, in the planning of your research, or in your clinical work? And that, I think, calls for collaborations between ethicists and scientists. There are many ways in which you will be clear already about things. You're worried about something and you might want some input to help you think that through. So that's what I've called here the responsive aspect of ethics. We provide to some extent a service just helping you to think through those things. But I also think inevitably there is a proactive element to that too. So there may well be things that you in the field of neuroscience all agree about, but actually it's important to ask questions about those things. Or there may be things that that you're not paying sufficient attention to. So one of the roles of an ethics partner is to try to bring some attention to those. And this is about being a critical friend. So it's as I say, it's about being constructive and supportive of science, but nonetheless, being able to raise questions that wouldn't normally be raised in the community of scientists. And also to declare a certain amount of self-interest in this process. I think that one of the things that enables our centre to be at the cutting edge of ethics research and to continue to be at the cutting edge of ethics research is science. We get to identify ethical questions that are interesting, and we identify them early, and we have a more contextually rich understanding of those problems. So we help you, hopefully, but we also help ourselves. And our centre's now one of the biggest in the world, between 55, 60 people. And it's really all grown out of these interactions with science. So the starting point, I think, is to think about this, the ethical significance. I'm going to go back over some of those points in more detail related to Lifebrain. So I think, the work that you've done and the findings that you've published really illustrate very nicely the value of the large-scale data-driven research in neuroscience. And that, is incredibly important ethically in itself. And you've identified the need for the creation and the sustainability of large-scale brain image cohorts internationally. But one of the things that's interesting about that is that you talk about linking them up with other forms of data, so other kinds of health data. I can completely see the importance of that, and various kinds of biological samples. So this is clearly important ethically. So the question then is, well, what's required against that kind of background? What's required to ensure that this is successful as an endeavor into the future, but is so scientifically and ethically, but also is able to maintain well-founded public trust and confidence, or the trust and confidence of funders, or the trust and confidence of partners in the collaboration, people who are sharing data. There's one of the things I've always been interested in, I won't say anything much about it today, is the internal ethics of scientific collaboration. You're all working together towards a bigger sort of goal, but that involves giving something up, giving up a degree of control. So how does one think about that? It's a big issue in genomics, and I'm sure it's a big issue in neuroscience too. So one way of thinking about the solution to how we make sure that research in this field is ethical has traditionally been to say we've got to get really good consent. So I'm not talking about the collaborations now, I'm talking about the relationships of the data and participants. So ethicists since Nuremberg and Helsinki and so on have tended to say, if you get the consent really well, really good, valid consent. So what we mean by that is the consent's properly informed, that it's voluntary and it's competent, then that's the best way to guarantee ethical research. I think there are a number of ways in which that's problematic. I think consent is very important, and I'll say more about that in a minute, but I think it can't do the whole job. There are two reasons why that's important. So one is an obvious one, which is presumably the value of neuroscience in many areas will be looking at people who lack the capacity to consent, or may have partial capacity to consent. And I think in the ethics world and to some extent in regulations, we've dealt with that to some extent. We've got ways of addressing that to some extent at least. But I think another and a kind of in this context more interesting problem is the fact that fully informed consent just isn't possible when you're creating a large data set, large database bringing together samples data and health records that as a research resource for researchers in the future. What would it mean to have very specific informed consent in that context? It doesn't require really me to say that that's clearly not going to be possible. It's not going to be possible to know what project will be done in 6 months' time, by whom, how long it will last, what kind of information we use, and what kind of findings might come out of that. But I think it's the interesting kind of one interesting way of thinking about this is that in a collaboration, I'm not sure if it's true in neuroscience, but my guess it is that in a large collaboration, many of the individual scientists involved who are experts in their field won't necessarily understand the project as a whole in a deep way. They'll understand their area of it, and they will have been brought in because they have a particular set of skills that relate to, for example, computational biology or some other kind of thing, and won't necessarily have a full understanding of the whole project. So if we can't expect all the scientists in the collaboration to understand every detail of the project, clearly it's impossible to expect a participant to do that. And what that suggests is that consent will inevitably have to be broad and open-ended to some degree and imperfect. But also it's also going to be imperfect. So what we need to, at the very least, is to have an approach which is sort of consent plus other things. So this is sort of, you can see how this relates to data sharing. So one problem you might say is, well, if consent is always going to be against a background of uncertainty about science, uncertainty about the findings and so on, and it's going to be open-ended in this way, then consent is not going to be valid. So we shouldn't be doing this kind of thing. And there are people who make those kind of cases, obviously. Or you should be trying to find ways to be very specific about consent. And some models for that, for example, have tried to do these sort of dynamic consent models where you have sort of constant interaction between participants and research. And it doesn't take too much thought to realize that isn't going to solve the problem, because, as we've said, it's impossible to understand the whole project as a whole for most people anyway. So just speaking to people more frequently doesn't solve the problem of consent, really. So consent can't do all of the work of research ethics. It needs to be done well, but it can't do everything. And I think there are a couple of questions we can ask, which might, I think, throw some light on the way to think about ethics here. So one question might be to say, what kinds of additional protections need to be in place to make sure that participants who are giving imperfect consent, imperfect and open-ended, are not going to be subjected to unjustified levels of harm or intrusion into their lives. So that, I think, isn't a question that can be answered by saying, let's get consent. It's a question about scientific practice, data access, data sharing, and so on. Another way of asking that question would be, even though we've got good consent, we still need to think about questions of well-founded public trust and confidence and what might be required for those. And again, none of this means that consent doesn't need to be done well. It does. I'm not saying consent is unimportant, which sometimes people have criticized me for. So how should we think about well-founded public trust and confidence? So I think there are a couple of distinctions that it's important to acknowledge here. One is the difference between trust and trustworthiness. So, for example, in the area of genetics, there's been this move towards thinking about trusted research environments, as if by calling it trusted research environment, it just makes it trusted. And clearly, you have to pay attention to what's required to be trustworthy before you can clarify what counts as well-founded trust, as opposed to just trust that people give without thinking about it. So I think maybe we need to shift. I'm in favor of trusted research environments, but maybe we need to shift to thinking about secure and well-governed research environments and hoping that will create trust. But I also think there are problems with this kind of approach anyway, because if you create too many rules around data sets, then there's a potential to limit the scope of the science that might be done. And as I say, it started out with this view that good quality science is an ethically important thing. So there are lots of examples of where people have, in well-intentioned ways, created boundaries around what's acceptable with data, and it's had impacts that may not have been foreseeable. So, for example, in the UK, there's a cohort called the 1958 birth cohort, which was a great resource. But one of the things that patients were told at the time was there will be no commercial private involvement in research on this data, which means that much contemporary research can't be done using that data set because they often involve commercial partnerships or technology partners. So you kind of, there's a danger that you might kind of place limits that the participants probably wouldn't have wanted if they'd understood that. And I think trusted research environments have the potential to do that. So what happens, for example, if you want to compare, for good scientific reason, the data that's kept in two separate trusted research environments? How does one think about that in the future? Seems important. So it raises these questions about privacy, for example, and what are its appropriate limits. I don't think, as a scientist, as an ethicist, I don't think you can have 100% privacy and scientific progress. So, and most people would recognize that that's put to them. So what as a society, how does a society, we have a sensible conversation about the limits, the appropriate limits of privacy and how we manage that? I think that's an important question. I won't say much about this because I've already mentioned. So it does strike me that a really important ethical consideration in the context of data sharing and the kind of research that you're doing is to think about how do we work with technology and commercial partners in ways that would be seen by us and by others as ethically appropriate. The Wellcome Trust has done a number of surveys of public attitudes in relation to data, and the public in those surveys recognize the value of research which uses large data sets and involves commercial partners. They recognize the value, but they also see the high risk associated with that. So how do we work with the public that sees things in that kind of way? They recognize the involvement of commercial partners is essential to progress. And I think there's a whole range of ways in which we might do that. And so I've listed some of them here on this slide, but we need to think carefully about that. I'm one of the directors of something called Genomics England, the 100,000 Genomes Project. And this issue comes up all the time with the participants. How do you manage these relationships in a way which is transparent? And there are a number of ways in which people think about that. And I in the interest of time, I won't go through that, but I'm happy to talk about it. And then I just wanted to raise a number of other kind of ethical sets of considerations that relate to the future. And I think, I'm assuming you talk about these kind of things anyway. So one of the issues one of the elements of research ethics that's changed quite a lot in recent years is how we think about the ethics of involving vulnerable participants or vulnerable groups in research. So research ethics has had this tradition of saying that the default position should be that you don't involve vulnerable participants and vulnerable groups in medical research where there are risks associated. And that's had a long history of excluding, for example, pregnant women from research, children, and people who lack capacity. And if you think about, for example, vaccine research during COVID, for example, it took huge amounts of effort to try to get pregnant women involved in that and huge amounts of resistance to that. But this view about research ethics, at least in the ethics literature, about vulnerable groups in the ethics literature has changed. Most ethics guidelines now, most published research in ethics, tries to emphasize the importance of a shift from the idea of protecting people from research to the idea of protecting them through research, which seems to me an important shift, an important paradigm shift. So what requires justification in that context is excluding people from research rather than including them from research. And clearly the research has to be done well, it has to be done ethically, but I think that's actually a better position to be in. So this is, and then I'm sure you've talked about this, the ethical importance of diversity in data sets strikes me as being increasingly important. Lots of ethical issues being raised in relation to bias in data sets and a range of ways in which the lack of diversity in large scale data sets is problematic. There are two main reasons I think to suggest that's important in the context of this. So first is, I think research participation is an opportunity that ought to be available to everyone. And we've got a number of ways, structural ways and other ways in which people from diverse populations don't get access. And it's in many ways associated with other things. For example, the fact that people often don't have access to services in an equal way means they don't get asked to be involved in research. And there's a whole range of questions there. But I also think there's another reason for this being important. And this is to ensure that the tools that you develop or that are developed using your data are going to be developed in a way which means they're available and valuable to all members of society, no matter where they come from. And a good example in genomics where this isn't the case currently is if you've got a woman, for example, who has breast cancer, has a genetic test, produces, when this shows she's, for example, she's negative for the main breast cancer genes, but she has a couple of variants of unknown or uncertain significance, but she happens to be from Iran or Syria or somewhere. Those variants of unknown significance are very hard to interpret because there aren't people from those ethnic origins in the data sets, generally speaking. So similar things presumably apply in the context of neuroscience too, I'm assuming. Okay, final point, but I've got 3 slides to do this, but I'll do them quickly. Another way in which ethics has changed, I think, in the last few years is it used to place a strong emphasis on the importance of keeping separate research and clinical practice. for a whole range of reasons, lots of them to do with consent and the idea that people might get confused about when they're participating in research, thinking they're being treated when they're not, or they might feel pressure not to say no when they're asked by a doctor. So there's a whole range of ways. But increasingly, as you all know, that relationship is breaking down, and much good research is done at the interface between research and clinical practice now. And I think the number of questions that arise out of that, one of them is, how does that change the responsibilities that scientists have to the data and the samples that they're dealing with? Traditionally, scientists, for example, in UK Biobank have said, we have no responsibility to the participants because we are researchers, so we don't feed anything back. That's changed, I think, and now it's less easy to justify not having some sense of responsibility. So what are your responsibilities in relation to incidental findings, secondary findings? And by that, I mean findings that might be deliberately looked for as opposed to ones that just happen by chance. And is there a duty to reanalyze data sets on a fairly regular basis in the light of new knowledge so that the patients who've been involved in producing that data get some benefit? So, for example, there is an active campaign by the participants in the 100,000 Genomes Project at the moment to get a commitment to regular reanalysis of the data set so that they will benefit. Lots of work needs to be done on those issues. And I'm going to finish by raising a question about innovation in medicine, which I think is kind of interesting personally. So if you think about the way in which research and innovation has happened in much of medicine, it's tended to take a very structured form. So, for example, the idea of the clinical trials, going through this process, and you're only allowed to release a drug to be treated, for patients to be treated once it's been through this very rigorous process. If you compare that with innovation in Silicon Valley, which this is a picture of, the idea there is the approach there is to you develop an innovation of some kind, whether it's a kind of software or phone, you release it, and then you fix it in the light of bugs. So you work on it in situ. And it seems to me that in the context of data-driven science, at this interface between clinical practice and research, neither of these quite works. So it doesn't seem to me sustainable to stick with an old-fashioned approach to medical innovation, which is based in a way which is very conservative. But it clearly isn't right also just to release things into medical practice without some kind of consideration of, for example, safety and so on. So how do we think about innovation in this space? I think is a really important scientific and ethical consideration. And a good example is the polygenic risk score, and I think how we think about that. So I will just finish by saying, I think, congratulations are due to you as a group for the work that you've done. I think it's really important work. I hope I've illustrated the value of conversations between scientists and ethicists, and hope that we can continue those conversations in the future. I think it's very important, and important from an ethical perspective, that participants and communities are involved in those conversations too. And I know that's what's going to come next, so I won't say anything much more about that. But I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts in the discussion. So thank you. Sorry.